My son died in a car accident. At 75, I had billions in the bank but had lost what mattered most. One day, I walked into the kitchen and saw my maid's daughter eating leftovers. She looked at me and said, "Can I save the bone for Mom? Since Dad passed, things got hard." When I asked who her father was, my world collapsed. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. The house felt like a mausoleum. Every room echoed with memories I wasn't ready to face. Every corner held shadows of a life that ended too soon. At 75, I had everything money could buy and nothing that truly mattered. My son David had been gone for 6 months now, taken in a car accident that still didn't feel real. I wandered through the mansion's halls like a ghost in my own home. The staff moved quietly around me, their whispered conversations stopping whenever I entered a room. They meant well, but their pity felt suffocating. Geneva, my housekeeper, was the only one who didn't treat me like broken china. She'd been with us for 7 months now, arriving shortly after David's death when I could barely function enough to hire help. That Thursday afternoon, I found myself walking toward the kitchen, drawn by the sound of something unusual. Not the typical clatter of meal preparation, but something softer, more secretive. I pushed through the swinging doors and stopped short. There, sitting cross-legged on the floor beside the industrial refrigerator, was a small girl. She couldn't have been more than 8 years old, with dark hair pulled back in a messy ponytail and clothes that had seen better days. In her hands was a plate that clearly held leftovers from yesterday's dinner. She looked up at me with wide, startled eyes the color of coffee. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then she scrambled to her feet, nearly dropping the plate in her haste. "I'm sorry, ma'am," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I didn't think anyone would mind if I just—" "Who are you?" I asked, though something about her face tugged at my memory in a way I couldn't place. "I'm Milani," she said, clutching the plate against her chest. "Geneva's my mom. She said I could wait here while she finishes upstairs." I studied her more carefully. She was thin, too thin, and there was a maturity in her eyes that no child should have. The way she held herself suggested she was used to being invisible, to taking up as little space as possible. "What are you eating?" I asked, stepping closer. Milani's cheeks flushed pink. "Just some leftover pot roast. Mom said it was okay since it was just going to be thrown away anyway." She paused, then added in an even smaller voice, "Can I save the bone for Mom? Since Dad passed, things got hard, and Mom said bones make the best soup stock." The words hit me like a physical blow. This child, this beautiful little girl, was eating scraps from my table while I let perfectly good food go to waste. But it was more than that. Something about the way she tilted her head when she spoke, the stubborn set of her jaw, reminded me so strongly of David when he was young that my breath caught in my throat. "Your father passed away?" I asked gently, lowering myself into one of the kitchen chairs to be at her eye level. Milani nodded solemnly. 6 months ago, in a car accident. She looked down at the plate in her hands. He was coming home from work and it was raining really hard. Mom said sometimes bad things just happen to good people. 6 months ago, the same time David died. I felt something cold settle in the pit of my stomach, though I couldn't have said why. Thousands of people died in car accidents every year. It was just a coincidence. "I'm sorry for your loss," I said, and meant it. "What was your father's name?" "Marcus," she said, her voice growing even quieter. "Marcus Chen. He worked really hard to take care of us, but he was always kind. Even when he was tired, he would read me stories before bed." I filed the name away, though it meant nothing to me. "And now it's just you and your mother?" Milani nodded again. "Mom works really hard too. She cleans houses and takes care of people like you. She said you've been very sad since your son went away." The innocence in her voice when she said, "went away," nearly broke my heart. Geneva had clearly tried to shelter her daughter from the harsh reality of death, at least when it came to explaining my grief. "Yes," I said simply. "I have been very sad. I have." Maybe you and Mom can be sad together, Milani suggested with the wisdom that sometimes comes from children who've seen too much. Mom cries sometimes when she thinks I'm sleeping. Maybe crying with someone else would help. I stared at this remarkable little girl, wondering how someone so young could possess such emotional intelligence. There was something almost familiar about her insight, as if I'd heard similar words before from another child's mouth. Milani? Geneva's voice called from the doorway, sharp with panic. What are you doing in here? I turned to see my housekeeper frozen in the entrance, her face pale with what looked like fear rather than mere embarrassment. Geneva was a woman in her early 30s, with the same dark hair as her daughter, and worry lines that seemed too deep for her age. I'm sorry, Mrs. Richardson, Geneva said quickly, moving toward her daughter. Milani knows she's not supposed to bother you. Come on, sweetheart. Let's go wait in the car. She wasn't bothering me, I said, surprised by the sharpness in my own voice. In fact, she was quite delightful company. Geneva's eyes darted between me and Milani, and I caught something there. Guilt, maybe, or fear. It was the look of someone caught in a lie, though I couldn't imagine what she might be lying about. Thank you for being kind to her, Geneva said carefully. But we should really be going. I just finished the upstairs bathrooms. Geneva, I said, standing slowly. How long did you say you'd been in the area? About 7 months, she replied, but her voice wavered slightly. We moved here from Sacramento after Marcus died. Fresh start, you know? I nodded, though something about her answer felt rehearsed. And you found work quickly? I was lucky, Geneva said, her hand moving protectively to Milani's shoulder. Mrs. Patterson at the employment agency said you needed someone right away. That was true. In the weeks following David's death, I'd been incapable of managing the household staff. My previous housekeeper had quit, overwhelmed by my grief and erratic behavior. Geneva had arrived like an answer to a prayer I hadn't known I was praying. Well, I said, watching as Geneva guided Milani toward the door. Perhaps next time Milani visits, she could join me for a proper meal instead of eating leftovers on the floor. Geneva's grip tightened on her daughter's shoulder. That's very kind, but I couldn't impose. It wouldn't be an imposition, I said firmly. A child shouldn't have to eat scraps. As they left, I heard Milani whisper to her mother. She's nice, Mama. She has sad eyes like yours. I stood alone in the kitchen, staring at the spot where Milani had been sitting. Something was bothering me, gnawing at the edges of my consciousness, like a half-remembered dream. The way she'd spoken about her father, the timing of his death, even the way Geneva had looked when I'd asked questions. But it was more than that. It was the child herself. Those eyes, that stubborn jaw, the way she'd tilted her head when thinking. Where had I seen those gestures before? As I walked back to my study, David's words from years ago echoed in my memory. Sometimes the most important truths are the ones we're not ready to hear, Mom. I had no idea how prophetic those words would prove to be. I couldn't stop thinking about Milani. Over the next few days, she haunted my thoughts in a way that was both comforting and deeply unsettling. There was something about her that pulled at memories I couldn't quite grasp, like trying to remember a song with only a few notes to guide you. Geneva arrived the following Monday with Milani in tow again. I'd been waiting, positioned in the morning room where I could see the kitchen entrance. I told myself it was coincidence, but I knew better. I needed to see the child again, to understand why she affected me so profoundly. This time, I intercepted them before Geneva could leave Milani waiting somewhere out of sight. Good morning, I said, stepping into their path. Milani, would you like to see the garden while your mother works? The little girl's face lit up, but Geneva's expression grew tight. Mrs. Richardson, I don't want Milani to be a burden. Children are never a burden, I said, though the words tasted bitter. How many times had I failed to live up to that principle with my own son? Besides, the gardens are beautiful this time of year. It seems a shame to waste them on an old woman who rarely appreciates them anymore. Geneva looked trapped, unable to refuse without seeming ungrateful. She knelt down to Milani's level, speaking in rapid, whispered Spanish. I caught enough to understand she was telling her daughter to be good, to stay close, not to touch anything. She'll be fine, I assured Geneva, extending my hand to Milani. Won't you, dear? Milani nodded eagerly and slipped her small hand into mine. The contact sent an unexpected jolt through me. Her hand was warm and slightly rough, the hand of a child who helped with household chores. But there was something else, something in the shape of her fingers that made my chest tighten. As we walked through the garden, Milani chattered with the unconscious ease of a child who hadn't yet learned to guard her words. She told me about the small apartment she shared with her mother, about how she helped with laundry folding and dish drying, about the picture books they borrowed from the library because buying new ones was too expensive. Mama reads to me every night, she said, stopping to examine a rose bush. She does different voices for all the characters. She's really good at the monster voices. What about your father? I asked carefully. Did he read to you too? Milani's face grew wistful. Sometimes. But he was always really busy. Mama said he worked extra hard to make sure we had everything we needed. She looked up at me with those unsettling, familiar eyes. Did your son like to read when he was little? The question caught me off guard. Yes, I said softly. He loved adventure stories, pirates and treasure hunters and brave knights. I like those too, Milani said, then added with startling insight. Mama says when people we love go away, we keep them alive by remembering the things they liked. I stared down at her, this wise little girl who spoke about loss with the gravity of someone far older. Your mother sounds very smart. She is. She knows lots of things. She can fix almost anything that breaks, and she makes the best pancakes in the whole world. Milani paused, bending to pick up a fallen flower petal. She gets sad sometimes, though, especially when she looks at old pictures. Pictures of your father? Milani nodded, but then her expression grew thoughtful. And other pictures too. From before I was born. She keeps them in a box under her bed. Sometimes I catch her looking at them and crying. A chill ran down my spine. What kind of pictures? I don't know. She always puts them away when she sees me watching. Milani shrugged with the casual acceptance of a child used to adult mysteries. Grown-ups have secrets sometimes. Mama says it's not because they don't trust us, but because some things are too heavy for little hearts to carry. The phrase struck me like a lightning bolt. Too heavy for little hearts to carry. Those exact words. I'd heard them before, spoken in a different voice, at a different time. David had said them to me once, when he was perhaps 10 years old, trying to explain why he didn't want to tell me about some playground conflict. Where had he learned that phrase? Not from me. I'd been too practical, too focused on solutions rather than feelings. I'd taught him to be strong, to handle problems head-on, but someone had taught him gentleness, taught him that some burdens were meant to be shared carefully. Milani, I said, my voice strangely hoarse, do you remember anything about Sacramento? About your life before you moved here? She tilted her head in that achingly familiar gesture. A little. We lived in a smaller house, and I had a swing in the backyard. Papa used to push me really high, until Mama would get scared and make him stop. Her face clouded. But Papa traveled a lot for work. He was gone sometimes for days and days. What kind of work did he do? I'm not sure. Something with computers, I think. He always had a big bag with papers and a laptop. She brightened suddenly. But when he came home, he always brought me something special. Little things, like pretty rocks or funny pencils or books. My hands were trembling now. David had traveled frequently for business in the years before his death, computer consulting for various firms throughout California. And he'd always brought me small gifts when he returned, tokens that showed he'd been thinking of me even when we were apart. These trips, I said carefully. How often did your father go away? Maybe once a month, sometimes more. Mama said it was because he was really good at his job and people needed his help. Milani's voice grew smaller. I used to ask if I could go with him, but he always said it was just for grown-ups. Once a month? For how long? I thought back over the past few years, trying to remember David's travel schedule. He'd been going to Sacramento regularly, hadn't he? Something about a long-term client, a project that required frequent oversight. Milani, Geneva's voice cut through my spiraling thoughts. She was hurrying across the garden toward us, her face flushed with what looked like panic. "There you are. I've been looking everywhere." "We were just exploring," I said, studying Geneva's expression. "She's a delightful companion." Geneva's smile was strained. "I'm sure she is, but we really should be going. I have other houses to clean today." "Of course," I said, but I didn't move to release Milani's hand. "Geneva, I was wondering. You mentioned that Marcus traveled for work. What company did he work for?" The color drained from Geneva's face. It was freelance mostly. Computer consulting. Nothing you would have heard of. Computer consulting. I repeated slowly. How interesting. My son was in the same field. Geneva's eyes darted away from mine. Really? What a coincidence. But it didn't feel like a coincidence. Nothing about this felt like a coincidence anymore. What was the name of Marcus's primary client? I pressed. The one in Sacramento? "I don't remember," Geneva said quickly, reaching for Milani's other hand. "He handled all the business details. I just knew when he'd be traveling." She was lying. I could see it in the way her shoulders tensed, in the way she avoided my gaze. But why would she lie about something so simple? As I watched them walk away, Milani turned back to wave at me, and I felt that jolt of recognition again. This time, I knew what it was. The way she moved her hand, the slight tilt of her wrist, was exactly how David had waved as a child. Exactly. That evening, I sat in my study staring at the box of David's personal effects that I'd never been able to bring myself to sort through. His laptop, his business files, his appointment calendars, everything was there, waiting for me to find the courage to face it. Maybe it was time I did. I spent 3 sleepless nights staring at David's laptop before I finally found the courage to open it. My hands shook as I typed in his password, a combination of my birthday and his childhood dog's name that he'd never bothered to change. The screen flickered to life, and suddenly I was drowning in the digital remnants of my son's life. His calendar was a maze of appointments, meetings, and travel dates stretching back years. I scrolled through the entries, looking for anything related to Sacramento. What I found made my blood run cold. Monthly trips to Sacramento, going back almost 4 years. Always the same client listed, Chen Consulting Services, always overnight stays. Always coded in his calendar with a small heart emoji that I'd never noticed before. Chen. Marcus Chen. Milani's father. My vision blurred as the pieces began falling into place with sickening clarity. David hadn't been traveling to Sacramento for business meetings. He'd been traveling to see someone. Someone important enough to warrant a heart in his calendar. Someone he'd been visiting regularly for years. I fumbled through his email, searching for any mention of Chen or Sacramento. What I found was worse than I'd imagined. Dozens of emails, carefully filed in a folder labeled personal projects, dinner reservations, hotel bookings, transfers of money, always small amounts, always with notes like for M's ballet classes or grocery emergency. Monsieur Milani. My hands were trembling so violently I could barely scroll through the messages. There were photos attached to some emails, a birthday party for a little girl with familiar eyes, a woman with dark hair laughing at something off camera, David himself, relaxed and smiling in a way I hadn't seen in years, pushing a small child on a swing. The swing Milani had mentioned, in the backyard of her old house. I slammed the laptop shut and ran to the bathroom, barely making it before I was violently sick. When the retching stopped, I sat on the cold tile floor and tried to make sense of what I'd discovered. David had been living a double life. For 4 years, he'd been supporting another family, visiting them regularly, playing father to a child who wasn't supposed to exist. And now that child was in my kitchen, eating leftovers while I mourned the son who had betrayed everything I thought I knew about him. But there was something else. Something that made the betrayal even worse. In one of the photos, I'd seen a date stamp, Milani's 7th birthday party just 8 months ago. David had been there, smiling and present, while he'd missed my own birthday that same week because of a crucial business meeting. How many family dinners had he skipped? How many holidays had he cut short? How many times had I eaten alone while he was playing house with Geneva and Milani? The rage that swept through me was unlike anything I'd ever felt. It burned in my chest, consumed my thoughts, made my hands shake with the need to break something, anything. David was dead, beyond my reach, but Geneva was here. Geneva, who had brought her daughter into my home, who had let me fall in love with a child she knew was connected to my son's lies. I stormed through the house, looking for Geneva. I found her in the laundry room, folding towels with mechanical precision, while Milani colored quietly in the corner. "We need to talk," I said, my voice deadly calm. "Now." Geneva looked up, and I saw the exact moment she recognized the fury in my eyes. Her face went white, and she glanced quickly at Milani before nodding. "Milani, sweetheart," she said in Spanish. "Go wait in the kitchen. Have some juice and crackers." The little girl looked between us with the intuitive awareness children have for adult tension, but she obediently gathered her coloring supplies and left. Geneva waited until her footsteps faded before turning back to me. "You know," she said quietly, "it wasn't a question." "I know that Marcus Chen wasn't your husband," I said, each word falling like a stone into still water. "I know that the man who died in that car accident was my son, and I know that you've been lying to me since the moment you walked into this house." Geneva's composure cracked. Tears started flowing down her cheeks, but she didn't try to deny it. "How did you find out?" His laptop, his calendar. 4 years of visits to Sacramento. 4 years of supporting you and Milani while I sat here alone, wondering why my son seemed so distant. My voice was rising despite my efforts to control it. 4 years of lies. "It wasn't supposed to happen this way," Geneva whispered. "When David died, I didn't know what to do. Milani kept asking when Papa was coming home, and I couldn't tell her the truth. I couldn't explain that the man she loved was someone else's son, someone else's whole world. So you decided to come here? To work in my house, to let your daughter eat at my table, knowing what you knew?" Geneva wrapped her arms around herself, looking smaller and more fragile than I'd ever seen her. "I was desperate. David had been helping us financially, and when he died, I had nothing. No job, no family, no way to support Milani. I thought if I could just work for you for a while, save some money, maybe find a way to tell you about her." "Tell me what about her?" I demanded, though I already knew. The knowledge was sitting in my chest like a lead weight, waiting for confirmation. Geneva met my eyes, and I saw years of grief and fear and desperate love reflected there. "That she's your granddaughter." The words hung in the air between us, final and irreversible. Everything I thought I knew about my life, my family, my son's death, crumbled in that moment. David hadn't just been having an affair. He'd had a child, a daughter who called him Papa, and waited for him to come home from his business trips. "She doesn't know," Geneva added quickly. "Milani thinks Marcus was her father. David wanted it that way. He said it was too complicated, that you wouldn't understand." "Wouldn't understand what?" My voice cracked. "That my son was living a lie? That he was playing father to your daughter while treating me like an obligation?" "It wasn't like that," Geneva said fiercely. "David loved you. He talked about you all the time. But he was scared, Mrs. Richardson. Scared that you wouldn't approve of me, of Milani, of the choices he'd made." "What choices? Having an affair? Abandoning his responsibilities?" Geneva flinched. "Choosing love over expectation. David said you had plans for his life. Plans that didn't include a housekeeper and her daughter." The accusation hit me like a slap. Had I been so controlling, so demanding, that my own son felt he couldn't share the most important parts of his life with me? Had I driven him to create a secret family because he couldn't trust me with his real one? "He was going to tell you," Geneva continued, her voice breaking, "after Milani's 8th birthday. He said he was tired of living in 2 worlds, tired of pretending. He wanted us to be a real family, but he'd never gotten the chance." The accident had taken that possibility away, leaving Geneva alone with a daughter who didn't know her true parentage, and me alone with a son I'd never really known. "Where were they going that night?" I asked. "David and Marcus?" Geneva's tears came harder now. David was taking Marcus to meet you, finally. Marcus was my boyfriend, my partner in raising Milani, even though he wasn't her biological father. David wanted to do right by all of us. He was going to bring Marcus here, introduce him as Milani's stepfather, and then tell you the truth about everything. The irony was crushing. David had died trying to fix the lie, trying to bring his two worlds together. And in the aftermath, Geneva had perpetuated the deception out of desperation and grief. "Why didn't you tell me when you came to work here?" I asked. "Why let me believe Milani was just your daughter?" "Because I was terrified," Geneva admitted. "Terrified that you'd hate her for existing. Terrified that you'd blame her for David's choices. I thought if you could get to know her first, see how special she is, maybe you could forgive the circumstances of her birth." I stared at this woman who had carried such an enormous secret, who had watched me grieve my son while knowing she was grieving him too. In her own way, Geneva had lost as much as I had. More perhaps because she'd lost the man she loved and the father of her child, but hadn't been allowed to mourn publicly. "She really doesn't know?" I asked. Geneva shook her head. "David made me promise. He said if anything ever happened to him, I should let Milani believe Marcus was her father. He thought it would be easier for everyone. But it wasn't easier. It was a lie that had trapped us all in different kinds of pain." From the kitchen came the sound of Milani's voice, humming a tune I recognized. It was a lullaby I used to sing to David when he was small, one I'd never heard from anyone else's lips. "He taught her that song," Geneva said, following my gaze. "He said his mother used to sing it to him." My throat closed. Even in death, David was reaching across the divide he'd created, connecting me to the granddaughter I'd never known existed. The weight of secrets was crushing, but underneath it all was a more painful truth. I had a granddaughter who needed me, and I had no idea how to be the grandmother she deserved. The silence in the laundry room stretched between Geneva and me like a chasm. My granddaughter. The words echoed in my head, but they felt foreign, impossible. 8 years old, and I'd never known she existed. 8 years of birthdays, scraped knees, first days of school, bedtime stories, all shared with strangers while I sat alone in my empty mansion. "Tell me everything," I said finally, my voice hoarse from the weight of revelation. "From the beginning. No more lies." Geneva sank into the folding chair beside the dryer, looking older than her 32 years. "I met David 4 years ago when I was cleaning offices downtown. He worked late most nights, and we started talking. Just small talk at first, but he seemed lonely, really lonely." I thought back to that time. David had just gone through a difficult breakup with a woman I'd hoped he might marry. Sarah, her name was. Sophisticated, educated, from a good family. Everything I thought he needed. When that relationship ended, David had withdrawn from me even more than usual. "He never talked about family at first," Geneva continued, "but gradually, he opened up. He said he felt like he was disappointing everyone, especially his mother, that nothing he did was ever quite enough." The words stung because they held a grain of truth I didn't want to acknowledge. Had I been so demanding? So critical? I thought I'd been encouraging David to reach his potential, but maybe I'd only been pushing him away. We started meeting for coffee after I finished cleaning his building. He was so kind, so interested in my life. No one had ever asked me about my dreams before, my thoughts about books or movies or anything beyond just getting through the day. Geneva's voice grew softer, more nostalgic. When I told him I was pregnant, I expected him to run. Most men would have, but he didn't. No, he cried, actually. Said he'd never thought he could be a father, never thought he deserved to be loved that unconditionally. Geneva wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. He wanted to marry me right away, but I wouldn't let him. I could see he was torn between two worlds, and I didn't want to be another obligation weighing him down. "So, you let him live a double life instead?" Geneva flinched at my tone. "I let him figure out what he wanted. He said he needed time to prepare you, to find the right way to tell you about us. He was terrified you'd think I was after his money, that you'd see Milani as some kind of mistake." I wanted to deny it, but the truth was, I probably would have. A housekeeper with a baby, targeting my successful son? I would have seen it as manipulation, as gold digging. The realization made me feel sick. He supported you financially, I said. It wasn't a question. He tried to. I didn't want his money, but he insisted on helping with doctor bills when I was pregnant, then later with childcare so I could work. He said Milani was his responsibility, his joy. He wanted to provide for her. Geneva's voice grew stronger, more defensive. But I worked too, Mrs. Richardson. I cleaned houses, babysat other people's children. I never wanted to be dependent on anyone. What about Marcus? When did he come into the picture? Geneva's expression softened. About a year after Milani was born. He was a client, actually. I was cleaning his apartment and Milani was with me because my babysitter was sick. She was fussy, crying, and I was so embarrassed. But Marcus just picked her up and started making funny faces until she laughed. I could picture it. Milani as a toddler, charming a stranger with her smile. She had that effect on people, that natural warmth that drew others in. Marcus knew about David from the beginning, Geneva continued. I was honest with him about everything. I thought he'd run too, but he said he'd rather love us part-time than not at all. He became Milani's stepfather in every way that mattered, even though David was her biological father. And David was okay with this arrangement? He was grateful for it, actually. He loved Milani desperately, but he wasn't ready to be a full-time father. Having Marcus there meant David could visit without the pressure of daily responsibilities. It meant Milani had a father figure who was present all the time, not just on weekends and business trips. The complexity of their arrangement boggled my mind. 3 adults, navigating love and parenthood and sacrifice in ways I couldn't have imagined, and through it all, a little girl who was loved by all of them, protected by their lies, even as those lies isolated her from half her family. Did David ever talk about bringing Milani to meet me? Geneva nodded. All the time, especially in the last year. He said he was tired of hiding, tired of missing parts of Milani's life because he couldn't explain where he'd been. He wanted her to know her grandmother, wanted you to see how amazing she was, but he was afraid I'd reject her. He was afraid you'd reject him, Geneva corrected gently. He said you had very clear ideas about what his life should look like, and a housekeeper's daughter didn't fit that picture. I closed my eyes, remembering all the conversations David and I had shared about his future. The suitable women I'd introduced him to, the social events I'd encouraged him to attend, the life I'd mapped out for him without ever asking what he wanted. Had I been so controlling that my own son felt he couldn't share his happiness with me? The night of the accident, I said. You said they were coming here, to tell me everything. Geneva's face crumpled. David had finally gotten the courage. He'd proposed to me the week before, said he was done living in pieces. He wanted to marry me, adopt Marcus officially as Milani's stepfather, and bring us all together as a family. He said it was time you met your granddaughter. But Marcus was nervous about meeting me. Terrified, Geneva admitted. He kept asking David what he should wear, what he should say. David finally told him to just be himself, that anyone who loved Milani couldn't be all bad. She let out a bitter laugh. Marcus spent that whole day practicing how to shake your hand, how to introduce himself as Milani's father without lying, but without revealing the whole truth right away. The image of this man, nervous about meeting me, preparing to help my son navigate the revelation of my granddaughter's existence, broke something inside me. He'd died trying to help David do the right thing. What was the plan? I asked. How were they going to tell me? David was going to bring Marcus here for dinner, casual, just as a friend at first. Then he was going to show you pictures of Milani, maybe videos of her dancing or singing. He wanted you to fall in love with her before you knew who she was. Geneva's voice grew wistful. He said once you saw how special she was, the rest wouldn't matter. But they'd never made it to dinner. The rain had been heavy that night, the roads slick. By the time I'd wondered why David was late, they were both already gone. I waited for 3 hours, Geneva continued. Milani kept asking when Papa and Marcus were coming home. I made excuses, Told her they were probably just caught in traffic. When the police came to the door, she shuddered. I had to tell Milani that both her fathers were gone. Both her fathers. The phrase highlighted the beautiful, complicated family they'd built together. A family I'd never been allowed to be part of because my son hadn't trusted me enough to share it. After the funeral, Geneva said, I didn't know what to do. Marcus's family didn't have much money, and I couldn't afford to stay in Sacramento without David's help. I heard through a mutual friend that you needed a housekeeper, and I thought maybe it was a sign. A sign to what? Torture me with what I'd lost? A sign that maybe Milani could know her grandmother after all, Geneva said firmly. I thought if I worked here, if you got to know her naturally, maybe someday I could find the courage to tell you the truth. But you didn't plan on me finding out like this. Geneva shook her head. I thought I had more time. I thought maybe when she started school here, when she was older and could understand the complexity of it all, then maybe I could explain everything. From the kitchen came the sound of Milani's laughter, bright and musical. She was talking to someone, probably herself, creating elaborate stories for her crayons. The sound was so much like David's childhood laughter that it physically hurt to hear. She has his laugh, I said without thinking. Geneva smiled through her tears. She has his stubborn streak, too, and his way of tilting her head when she's thinking really hard about something. I noticed that, I admitted. It's what made me suspicious in the first place. David used to say she was going to be trouble when she got older because she was too smart for her own good, just like he was. Geneva looked at me directly. She's a good kid, Mrs. Richardson. Better than good. She's kind and funny and resilient. She's survived losing two fathers and being uprooted from everything familiar, and she still finds reasons to smile every day. I believed her. In the brief time I'd spent with Milani, I'd seen glimpses of that strength, that innate goodness that reminded me so much of David at his best. What happens now? I asked. Geneva straightened her shoulders, and I saw the steel beneath her gentle exterior. That's up to you. I can take Milani and leave tonight if that's what you want. Find another job, another place to start over. I won't ask you for anything. And if I don't want you to leave, then maybe we can figure out how to be a family, the kind David wanted us to be. Geneva's voice was steady, but I could see the hope and fear warring in her eyes. Milani deserves to know her grandmother, and maybe you deserve to know her too. I thought about the empty years stretching ahead of me, the silence that had settled over this house since David's death. Then I thought about Milani's laughter echoing through these halls, about having a reason to bake cookies again, about bedtime stories and scraped knees and all the small, precious moments I'd missed. But beneath the longing was anger. Anger at David for keeping this from me. Anger at Geneva for perpetuating the lie. Anger at myself for being the kind of mother and mother-in-law who inspired such secrecy. I need time, I said finally. This is all too much to process at once. Geneva nodded. I understand. But Mrs. Richardson, please don't punish Milani for our mistakes. Whatever you decide about me, she's innocent in all this. She was right. Milani hadn't chosen to be born into this complicated web of love and lies. She was just a little girl who needed stability, who needed to know she was wanted. As Geneva left to collect her daughter, I stood alone among the towels and wondered if it was possible to love someone you'd been betrayed by. Because despite everything, despite the lies and the secrecy and the years of deception, I could feel my heart opening to the granddaughter I'd never known existed. The question was whether I could find a way to forgive the people who had kept her from me. 3 days passed in a haze of sleepless nights and unanswered questions. I'd asked Geneva to take some time off, claiming I needed space to process everything, but the truth was I couldn't bear to look at Milani without seeing David's eyes staring back at me. Every time I heard her voice echoing through the house, every glimpse of her playing in the garden felt like a knife twisting in an already bleeding wound. I spent those days going through David's belongings with forensic precision, looking for every trace of the life he'd hidden from me. What I found painted a picture of a man I'd never really known, despite having raised him for 35 years. Hidden in his desk drawer, beneath insurance papers and old tax returns, I found a small wooden box I'd never seen before. Inside were treasures that told the story of his secret fatherhood. Milani's first ultrasound photo, a hospital bracelet from the day she was born, her first drawing, a Mother's Day card she'd made for Geneva with David's name carefully printed at the bottom as Papa. Each item was a revelation and a betrayal. While I'd been wondering why David seemed distracted during family dinners, he'd been teaching his daughter to write. While I'd been planning holiday celebrations, he always found excuses to cut short. He'd been building traditions with another family. The most devastating discovery was a letter, written in David's careful handwriting and dated just 2 weeks before his death. My dearest Milani, by the time you read this, you'll be old enough to understand complicated things about love and family. I want you to know that you were never a secret because I was ashamed of you. You were a secret because I was afraid of losing you. Your grandmother is a wonderful woman, but she has very strong ideas about how life should be lived, and I was scared she wouldn't understand how much I love you and your mother. I hope someday you'll meet her and see that she has a heart big enough to love you too, if I can find the courage to let her try. You are the best part of me, little one. Never forget that. All my love, Papa. I read the letter 3 times before the words blurred through my tears. David had loved Milani desperately, but he'd been terrified of my judgment, terrified enough to live a double life for 4 years, rather than risk introducing us. What kind of mother had I been that my own son feared my reaction to his happiness? The guilt was suffocating, but I forced myself to continue searching. I needed to understand the full scope of what I'd missed, the complete picture of David's hidden life. In his laptop, I found video files that nearly broke me. Hours of footage of Milani growing up, from her first steps to her latest ballet recital. David behind the camera, his voice full of pride and love as he encouraged her to show Papa your pirouette, or tell Papa about your day at school. In one video, Milani couldn't have been more than 5 years old. She was wearing a pink tutu and attempting to teach David how to dance, her small hands trying to position his much larger ones correctly. No, Papa, she giggled. Like this, you have to be graceful like a swan, not clompy like an elephant. David's laughter in response was pure joy, the kind of unguarded happiness I hadn't heard from him in years. I think I'm more of a dancing bear, he said, deliberately stumbling for her amusement. Bears don't do ballet very well. That's okay, Milani said with the earnest sweetness of a child. Mama says it's not about being perfect. It's about having fun together. The wisdom in her words, the easy affection between them, the glimpse of David as a father rather than just my distant son, shattered something inside me. This was the man I'd lost, but it was also the man I'd never been allowed to know. But despite the overwhelming evidence, a small part of me still needed scientific confirmation. The rational part of my mind that had built a business empire demanded absolute proof before I could fully accept this new reality. I called Dr. Patricia Webb, my longtime physician and friend, and explained that I needed a discrete DNA test. She asked no questions, simply scheduled an appointment and provided the necessary materials. Getting Milani's sample was easier than I'd expected. When Geneva returned to work, I asked her to bring Milani along, claiming I'd missed having young energy in the house. It wasn't entirely a lie. The mansion had felt even more tomb-like without the sound of small feet running through the halls. While Geneva worked upstairs, I offered to help Milani with a craft project. As she concentrated on gluing sequins to a picture frame, I carefully collected a few strands of hair that had fallen on her collar. She was so absorbed in her artwork that she never noticed. "This is for you," she announced when she finished, holding up the sparkly frame. "So, you can put a picture of someone you love inside it." The innocence of the gesture nearly undid me. "It's beautiful, sweetheart. Thank you. Mama has lots of pictures of people she loves," Milani continued, carefully cleaning glue from her fingers. "She keeps them in a special box. There's one of a man who looks kind of like you, but younger. She cries sometimes when she looks at it." My heart stopped. "A man who looks like me?" Milani nodded solemnly. "Mama said he was someone very special who went to heaven. She keeps his picture next to the one of me and Papa at the park." David. Geneva had been keeping photos of David, grieving him in private while helping me grieve him publicly. The thought of her looking at his picture and crying, with no one to comfort her because their relationship had been a secret, added another layer to my growing understanding of the complexity of this situation. The DNA results arrived 5 days later. Dr. Webb called personally to deliver the news, though by then it was merely a formality. "Mabel," she said gently, "the test confirms a biological relationship. The child is definitely your granddaughter." I thanked her and hung up, then sat in my study staring at the official document that made it real. Milani Esperanza Chen was my granddaughter, David's daughter, my family. But knowing it scientifically and accepting it emotionally were two different things. The child I'd been falling in love with over the past few weeks wasn't just Geneva's daughter anymore. She was David's legacy, the living embodiment of the life he'd built without me. That evening, I asked Geneva to stay after work for a conversation. Milani was in the garden, chasing fireflies with the abandon of childhood, giving us privacy to talk. "The test confirmed it," I said without preamble. "She's David's daughter." Geneva nodded, unsurprised. "I know. I've always known." "Tell me about the pregnancy," I said. "I want to understand everything." Geneva settled into the chair across from my desk, her hands folded carefully in her lap. "I found out I was pregnant about 6 months after David and I started seeing each other. I was terrified. I was barely making ends meet as it was, and suddenly I was going to be responsible for another life." "Did you consider—" I couldn't finish the question. "Abortion?" Geneva's voice was matter of fact. "Yes, for about 10 minutes. But when I told David, he got this look on his face, like Christmas morning and pure terror all mixed together. He said he'd never thought he'd have the chance to be a father, that he'd always assumed he wasn't good enough, not good enough." Where had David gotten that idea? From me? From years of pushing him toward achievements and goals instead of simply loving him as he was? "He was amazing during the pregnancy," Geneva continued. "He read every book about babies he could find. He talked to Milani when she was still in my belly, told her stories about his own childhood, about the grandmother she would meet someday. The grandmother she would meet someday. David had always planned to tell me, had always intended for Milani to know her family. But he'd died before he could bridge that gap, leaving Geneva to navigate the aftermath alone. "What about the birth?" I asked. Geneva's face softened with memory. "David wanted to be there, but we decided it was too risky. Too many questions if someone saw him at the hospital with me. So Marcus was my labor coach, but David came later that same night." She smiled through tears. "He held her for 3 hours straight. Just sat in the rocking chair in her nursery, staring at her like she was a miracle." I closed my eyes, imagining David as a new father, overwhelmed by love for this tiny person he'd helped create. I should have been there. I should have been the one bringing meals, offering support, helping with those exhausting first weeks of parenthood. "He was a good father to her," Geneva said, reading my thoughts. "Limited by the circumstances, but devoted. He never missed a birthday or a Christmas. He taught her to ride a bike, helped her with homework, attended every dance recital and school play he could manage. But he missed things too, didn't he? Because he couldn't explain his absences to me." Geneva nodded reluctantly. "There were times when he had to choose. Your birthday dinner versus Milani's parent-teacher conference. A business obligation you'd arranged versus her first ballet performance. He tried to balance both worlds, but it wasn't always possible." The weight of my unknowing selfishness crushed down on me. How many times had I demanded David's attention on days when his daughter needed him? How many guilt trips had I laid on him for being distracted when he was actually worried about Milani's fever or school troubles? "I should have known," I said. "A mother should know when her child is living a double life." "David was very good at compartmentalizing," Geneva said gently. "He loved you, Mrs. Richardson. He talked about you constantly, worried about your loneliness, wanted to include you in our lives, but he was also terrified of disappointing you. Instead, he disappointed me by hiding the most important thing in his life. He was going to tell you," Geneva insisted. That last year, he talked about it almost daily. He'd gotten tired of the secrecy, tired of feeling like he was betraying everyone he loved. The night he died, he was finally ready to bring his two worlds together. But fate had stolen that opportunity, leaving us all to navigate the aftermath of his choices without him. Outside, Milani's laughter rang through the garden as she caught a particularly elusive firefly. The sound was so much like David's childhood laughter that it physically hurt to hear. "She's going to ask questions eventually," I said, "about why she never knew she had a grandmother, about why her father was a secret." "I know," Geneva said quietly. "I've been dreading that conversation for months. Maybe it's time we had it," I said, the words surprising me even as I spoke them. "Maybe it's time to stop protecting her from the truth." Geneva looked up sharply. "You want to tell her?" "I want her to know who she is," I said. "I want her to know that she has a family beyond just you and Marcus, that she's loved and wanted, even if the circumstances are complicated." Geneva was quiet for a long moment, watching Milani through the window. "And what about us? What happens to me in this scenario?" It was a fair question. Geneva had lied to me, had perpetuated David's deception even after his death. But she'd also been trapped by circumstances beyond her control, protecting her daughter the only way she knew how. "I don't know yet," I admitted. "I'm still angry, still hurt. But Milani needs stability, and you're her mother. Whatever happens between us, she comes first." Geneva nodded, tears sliding down her cheeks. "That's all I've ever wanted, for her to come first." As we sat in the gathering darkness, watching my granddaughter chase fireflies with innocent joy, I realized that David's death had stolen more than just his life. It had stolen the chance for all of us to become a family the right way, with honesty and openness and time to adjust. But maybe it wasn't too late to salvage something from the wreckage. Maybe there was still a chance to give Milani the grandmother she deserved, and to find in her the family I'd lost when David died. The question was whether I could find a way to forgive the people who had kept her from me, and whether I could forgive myself for being the kind of person they felt they needed to hide her from. The morning I decided to tell Milani the truth about her father, I woke before dawn with the weight of that choice pressing against my chest like a stone. For weeks, I'd been living in a strange limbo, knowing she was my granddaughter but unable to fully embrace her while the lies still stood between us. I found Geneva in the kitchen, preparing Milani's breakfast with the quiet efficiency that had become familiar. She looked up when I entered, her eyes immediately searching my face for clues about my mood, my intentions. "We need to tell her today," I said without preamble. Geneva's hands stilled on the orange she was peeling. "Are you sure you're ready?" "I'll never be ready," I admitted. "But she deserves to know who she is. And I can't keep pretending to be just the nice lady whose house her mother cleans." Milani chose that moment to bound into the kitchen, her hair still messy from sleep, wearing pajamas decorated with dancing unicorns. She climbed onto her usual stool at the counter and smiled at me with the easy affection that had developed between us over the past month. "Good morning, Mrs. Richardson," she said, then noticed the tension in the room. "Is everything okay?" Geneva and I exchanged glances. There was no perfect way to do this. No script for explaining to an 8-year-old that everything she thought she knew about her family was incomplete. "Sweetheart," Geneva said carefully, "Mrs. Richardson and I need to talk to you about something important. About your papa." Milani's face grew serious. She had the emotional intelligence of a child who'd learned early that adult conversations about her papa usually meant complicated things. "Did I do something wrong?" she asked. "No, baby," I said quickly, moving to sit beside her. "You've done nothing wrong. But there are some things about your papa that we haven't told you yet. Things that might seem confusing at first." For the next hour, Geneva and I carefully unwound the threads of truth that had been tangled for 8 years. We told Milani that David had been her biological father, that Marcus had chosen to love her as his own daughter even though they weren't related by blood. We explained that David had been my son, which made me her grandmother. Milani listened with the focused attention children give to information that will reshape their understanding of the world. She asked questions with startling clarity. Why hadn't David told people about her? Why hadn't she met me before? Was she still allowed to call Marcus her papa in her heart? Of course you can, I assured her. Marcus loved you and raised you. He'll always be your papa. But David was your biological father, and he loved you very much too. So I had two papas, she said thoughtfully. And now I have a grandmother I didn't know about. The simplicity with which she accepted this complex reality humbled me. Where I saw betrayal and deception, she saw additional love. Where I felt confusion and hurt, she found wonder in discovering she had more family than she'd known. Are you angry that we didn't tell you before? Geneva asked, her voice tight with worry. Milani considered this seriously. A little sad, she admitted. Because if I had known, I could have been your granddaughter for longer. She looked at me with those familiar eyes. But mostly, I'm happy. Mama has been sad since Papa David and Papa Marcus went to heaven. Maybe now she won't be so lonely. The insight in her words took my breath away. This child, who had every right to feel confused or betrayed, was thinking about her mother's happiness instead of her own disrupted worldview. Over the following weeks, we developed new routines that reflected our changed circumstances. Milani moved into the bedroom next to mine, the one I'd originally intended as David's childhood room preserved. Geneva took over the housekeeper's quarters that came with a small sitting room, giving them privacy while keeping us close. I discovered the joy of being a grandmother in ways I'd never imagined. Milani approached our relationship with the same openness she brought to everything else. She taught me games I'd forgotten existed, introduced me to animated movies that made me laugh until my sides hurt, and asked me endless questions about David's childhood. Did Papa David like to read when he was little like me? She asked one evening as we sat in the library, she with a chapter book and me with my usual biography. He loved adventure stories, I told her, pirates and treasure hunts and brave explorers. I like those too, she said with satisfaction. Maybe I got that from him, through the genes. Maybe you did. She was quiet for a moment, then asked, Do you think he would have liked to read with me? The question pierced my heart. I think he would have loved nothing more. These conversations became our way of building a bridge between the grandfather she'd never been allowed to know and the grandmother who was learning to love her. Through Milani's curiosity about David, I began to see my son through new eyes. Not just as the distant, dutiful man he'd become, but as the loving father he'd been in secret. Geneva and I navigated our own relationship more carefully. The betrayal I felt was real, but so was my understanding of her impossible position. She'd been protecting Milani the only way she knew how, just as David had been protecting all of us from a truth he feared would tear us apart. I want to make something clear, I told her one afternoon while Milani was at her new school. I'm changing my will. Geneva's face went white. Mrs. Richardson, I never expected. Everything will go to Milani, I continued. The house, the investments, the business holdings, all of it. She's David's daughter, my granddaughter, and my only heir. That's too much, Geneva protested. She's just a child. She needs security, I interrupted. She needs to know that she belongs somewhere, that she has a family legacy, and you need to know that you'll never have to eat leftovers on kitchen floors again. The reference to that first day I'd found Milani made Geneva flinch. I was trying to teach her not to take things for granted. I know, but she's my granddaughter, Geneva. She shouldn't have to be grateful for scraps from her own family's table. That conversation led to others about practical matters. Geneva would continue managing the household, but as a family member rather than an employee. Milani would attend the best schools, take music and dance lessons, have every opportunity David would have wanted for her. But more important than the money or opportunities was the simple fact of belonging. For the first time in her life, Milani knew she had extended family. She had a grandmother who attended her school plays, who helped with homework, who taught her to bake the same cookies I'd once made for David. 6 months after learning the truth, I received a call from Sarah, David's former girlfriend. She'd heard through mutual friends about Milani and wanted to express her condolences on my loss while also sharing her own grief. I always wondered why David seemed distracted during our last year together, she admitted. Now I understand. He was thinking about his daughter. Did you know? I asked. Did he ever mention her? Not directly, but there were signs, if I'd been paying attention. Phone calls he took in private, weekend trips he couldn't fully explain. I thought he was having doubts about our relationship, but maybe he was just torn between two different lives. After we hung up, I sat in David's old room. Now Milani's watching her sleep. She looked so much like him at that age, all long limbs and dark lashes. But there was something in her face that was purely her own, a peacefulness that David had rarely possessed. Perhaps that was Geneva's gift to her daughter, that ability to find contentment in simple things. Or perhaps it was Marcus's legacy, the security of being loved unconditionally by a man who chose to be her father. The next morning, Milani found me in the garden where I was tending the roses David had planted for me years ago. "Grandmother," she said, settling cross-legged on the grass beside me. The title still sounded new and wonderful each time she used it. "Yes, sweetheart. I was thinking about Papa David and Papa Marcus being in heaven together." I paused in my pruning, waiting for her to continue. "Do you think they're friends now?" Since they both loved me and Mama, the question was so pure, so hopeful, that it took my breath away. Where I had seen rivalry and complication, she saw the possibility of friendship. Where I had found reasons for jealousy and hurt, she found common ground. "I think they probably are," I said carefully. "I think they're both happy that you're safe and loved. And I think they're happy that you're not sad anymore," she added with the wisdom that consistently amazed me. She was right. The crushing grief that had consumed me since David's death had lightened, not because I missed him less, but because I had found a reason to embrace life again. In learning to love Milani, I had discovered a purpose that went beyond mourning what I'd lost. That evening, I called my lawyer to finalize the changes to my will. Everything would go to Milani, with Geneva as trustee until her daughter came of age. But I also added provisions for Geneva herself, ensuring she would never again have to worry about financial security. As I signed the documents, I thought about David's letter to Milani, the one where he'd hoped someday she would meet me and see that I had a heart big enough to love her too. He'd been right. My heart had expanded in ways I'd never thought possible. The granddaughter I'd never known existed had become the center of my world, not because I was trying to replace David, but because loving her felt like the most natural thing in the world. The house that had felt like a mausoleum was alive again with the sounds of childhood, laughter echoing in the halls, music playing from Milani's room, the constant chatter of a bright child who felt safe enough to share every thought that crossed her mind. Geneva and I had found our own rhythm, too. We would never be friends in the conventional sense. Too much pain and deception lay between us for that. But we had become something more important. Partners in raising Milani, united in our desire to give her the stable, loving family David had dreamed of creating. On a Sunday morning exactly 1 year after I'd first found Milani eating leftovers in my kitchen, I woke to the smell of pancakes and the sound of her singing in the kitchen. I found her standing on a step stool, carefully flipping pancakes while Geneva guided her hands. "Good morning, grandmother," she called out cheerfully. "I'm making breakfast for everyone because it's a special day." "What makes today special?" I asked, though I already knew. It was the anniversary of David's death, but also the anniversary of the day that brought Milani into my life. "Because today is the day our family got bigger instead of smaller," she said with the profound simplicity that characterized all her observations about our complicated situation. As we sat together at the kitchen table, eating pancakes and planning our day, I realized that David had achieved his goal after all. He'd brought his two worlds together, just not in the way he'd planned. Through his death, through the revelation of his secrets, through the love he'd inspired in all of us, he'd created the family he'd always wanted. It wasn't the family any of us had imagined, built as it was on loss and truth-telling and forgiveness. But it was real in a way that David's careful compartmentalization had never been. We belonged to each other now, not because of blood alone, but because we'd chosen to love through the complications and pain. And in the end, that choice had made all the difference. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below. And meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.